All right, welcome back. So, in today's lesson, we're going to cover one of the most important strategic concepts in chess. That is the concept of pawn chains. So, I see a lot of beginners not know how to read the pawn structure on the board and end up playing all sorts of random moves and end up getting in lost positions pretty quickly because they just can't read the position and the pawn chain. So what we're going to do today is essentially cover what pawn chains are, how to read them, and then how to make the most of them in your games, because this applies in every single game. So pawn chains, essentially, as you can sort of tell by the concept, by the name, it's a chain of pawns. In this case, it's very clear that this is white's pawn chain here, and this is black's pawn chain here. So we're going to go over a few examples. Just flick through, just so you can kind of see what the examples that we're going to go through are. So these are all different types of pawn chains or pawn structures, and they they tell you how to play the game. So your plan needs to be based on the structure. If you deviate from this, you'll pretty much find yourself in a strategically lost position pretty quickly. So what can we tell as white about this structure? What is the position trying to tell us? Well, the golden rule, as you can see on the right here, the golden rule is to play on the side of the board that your pawns point towards. So as white, your pawns are pointing towards the king side. That's by default where you end up having the most space. Oops. So if I kind of draw a little diagram this way, you've got a whole bunch of space this way. Your pieces have a lot of space to maneuver, and your pawns naturally support each other in this direction. So your plan as white is going to be to get your pawn to f4, to get your pawn to g4, pawn to f5, and then essentially either break through on the f-file by trading on e6, or pushing that pawn even more forward, or pushing this to g5 and g6. And black, who will usually have a kingside castle position in these types of structures, this is like a closed French defense structure, will essentially be trying to likewise play b5, b4 with support of the pawn on a5, and possibly a4, a3 to bust open on the queen side. That's, in a nutshell, what you're essentially going to 99% of the time in these types of positions play for as white and play for as black. Beginners can essentially sometimes not read that this is what your plan's meant to be, and then they might end up pushing for b3 or something like that, which essentially plays into black's plan, because black's going to play b5, b4. These pawns will get traded off, and then suddenly the queen side opens up. And what did we say? We said white's got more space on the king side for his pieces or her pieces, and black has more space on the queen side. So by opening up the queen side, black suddenly has the attack, because black's going to break through with their rooks, with their pieces on the queen side, and white's just going to get suffocated, because this pawn on c3 essentially stops white's pieces from being able to get onto the queen side. They've only got c2 and c1 through which to go onto the queen side. So let's take a look at another example. So just to quickly recap this example, this is a very common French defense type structure. Most of the time, black will even trade and have an open c-file, but this is essentially the main structure there. Let's flip it around. So this type of position comes up. It's almost like a reversed French defense structure, and likewise you can see black's going to be playing for f5 and f4, possibly supported with a g5 pawn push. Likewise, white is naturally going to be playing where the pawn chain is dictating, which is a b4 and b5 pawn push, probably supported by a4 as well. For the same reasons as the previous example. How does this type of position come up? Well, usually this type of structure will come up when on a queen's gambit type of structure, where black ends up playing e5, and then locking the center with e4. And likewise, in these positions, white will typically trade on d5 to create a pawn target here. Because if he doesn't, if he keeps the pawns here and locks it up, then black's quickly going to get an attack on white's king. So it's not in favor of white to close it up. But the pawns, likewise, dictate where the play needs to happen for both sides. So let's take a look at another very common structure. This is essentially a closed Sicilian type of structure where it usually comes up when white goes e4, e5, Sicilian defense, and then white typically would play something like knight c3 and then close the structure up with d3. But what are we trying to show with this type of a structure? When the pawns are on d3 and e4, and black has their pawns on d6 and c5, white's plan is essentially, you guessed it, to play f4, most likely to fianchetto the bishop this way, or even play g4 and f5, and again play on this side. This is a semi-closed type of structure, meaning it can open up at any point. Whoops, these analysis boards. If black's pawn was on d4, it would be closed, but since it's on d5, there's always that tricky pawn break that you've got to calculate d5, and you don't want to have a wide open king after some trades happen and your king's sort of kingside castling is just the pawns have been pushed too far and you're essentially weak there. But what you want to do is white in this type of position is definitely play for f4, get your knight onto f3, fianchetto your bishop, castle your king, and then probably push for an f5 or a g4, maybe supported this way. That's essentially what the pawn structure is telling you to do. Likewise, as black, let's just move these back to where they were. Likewise, as black, you're going to be playing for a b5 and a b4 type scenario. As you can see, you've got a fianchettoed bishop on g7, so you've got a lot of pressure on that b2 square. You control these dark squares pretty solidly with your pawns supported by the bishop. So you're going to be trying to push for these types of pawn breaks and open up on the queen side while white's playing for a kingside attack. Let's take a look at another one. This is a closed position. It's a Benoni type of pawn structure, which is, if you kind of go back to this one, so how we had it like this, black's got a very similar pawn structure. It's just that white's locked up the pawns in the center. White's got a bit more space. But in this case, black again is going to be playing where his pawn structure is dictating with a b5 push and trading and opening up that b file. On the other hand, white is most likely going to be playing for an f4 and e5 pawn push because, as you can see, that c4 and d5 pawn naturally beg for that e4 pawn to go to e5, which needs to be supported by f4. So this is the structure that white's going to be playing for with this pawn break on e5. Likewise, why would white not want to be playing for b4? Well, because black's got the pressure on that diagonal, as well as he's going to have the pressure with his rooks down this file once he plays b4 and opens things up. So if, let's say, these pawns get traded off, this is in favor of black because now the position is quite open on the queen side and black's pieces have all the opportunities to essentially come down on this side, whereas white's pawns now point towards the queen side, but black's really got that dark square control, especially on this b2 square. So when it's earlier on, white should be playing for a kingside attack, while black should be playing for that b5 pawn push. So let's take a look at this example. This is, if you look at it, it's exactly the same as the previous one, which was this, except the e5 pawn has been pushed. This is a King's Indian type of structure. The difference here is, whereas in this structure, black's playing for b5, in in this structure here, black's playing for f5. And white will be trying to solidify his pawn center by creating a pawn chain with f3 and then pushing b4 and c5. And this is 99% of the time the plan for both sides in a closed King's Indian type structure. Black will probably follow with f4, g5, g4, as so many countless games have been played by grandmasters and all sorts of levels. And white's going to try trade on this side, get his rooks down this diagonal, probably, get a knight to b5, put some pressure on c7 and d6, and essentially try play for queenside play. Let's look at a couple more examples. This is a structure where we looked at this structure, we looked at this structure. Now what happens if black has both pawns in this regard closed off? Well, here it really depends on who's quickest to get either this pawn push, losing control of my analysis board here. Black's essentially going to be trying to play for either a kingside attack again with f5 or a queenside attack and opening lines on the queenside with b5. Most desirably, as you can imagine, black's going to try to play for a kingside attack because white actually will struggle to open up the queenside, because even if he plays b4, black will probably just play b6, and then if white decides to trade, white's still pretty cramped on the queenside because he's got this random pawn on c4 that's just in the way more than anything, and black's going to start piling down the pressure on this side. So really it's up to black to decide which side of the board they want to play on and white to follow suit. White, on the other hand, if they're quick enough, they'll play g3 and f4. Black will probably fianchetto their bishop again and play for f5, and we usually see a trade of these pawns in this type of a situation, and then this square becomes a really key square because white will usually try to get a knight onto that square, and black's going to try get a knight either onto d4 via knight e7, f5, d4, or a bishop or something along those lines. But this is how the games typically progress in that type of a structure. Last but not least, this is sort of like this structure that we looked at, except it's reversed. Actually, we've got two more to go through. This is reversed. It usually comes by from English openings. So white will play c4, c2 to c4. Black will play e7 to e5. And then once the pawns come to d3 and d6, and the bishops get fianchettoed, take a guess how the play is going to continue. White's going to naturally try to play b4, b5 or c5, get those types of pawn breaks in, and black's naturally going to play for an f5 type of position, maybe even c6 just to blunt this bishop's diagonal, and possibly even, if they're feeling ambitious, a d5 and a d4. So black really is playing for that central and kingside control with his pawn chain, and white's playing for queenside control in this English type of setup. Last but not least, and these are all sort of basic level concepts, we can dive into more detail if anyone wants to. Just leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you want to see more of. This is kind of like a Dutch defense type structure. It's almost like that same Sicilian or English type structure, but it usually comes by when white goes d4, d5, and black plays f7, f5, and then the pawns just sort of come up next to them, c4, e6. I'm going to get used to this analysis board at some point. So e3, e6, the pawns start looking like this. Black usually gets their bishop on b7 to make the most of the light square control here. and white's going to struggle to do much on this diagonal with his fianchettoed bishop, so he's normally going to put his bishop on e2 or d3 and continue with c5, b4 and c5, because that's where the pawns are pointing towards. Likewise, black in this case is going to be playing for kingside pressure, so he's got space in this side of the board, so he'll probably get a knight to f6, make the most of that light squared control by getting a knight to e4. This bishop might be on e7. That rook might come up and across to attack the king. This queen might come to g5 or h4, depending on how it can move. And black's going to play for kingside pressure. But what black's not going to do in this position is play for e5, which essentially just opens up this diagonal against his king. Also, it allows white to seize even more space in the center with the d5 pawn push. Black's essentially going to try keep this structure as much as he can, possibly move for a g5, g4 pawn push or an f4 pawn push to open up lines against the white king. But as you can see, the main ideas are playing for where your pawn chain dictates you play towards. That's a golden rule. And if we see old mate's quote on the right here, pawns, they are the soul of this game. They alone form the attack and defense. And that's a quote from Philidor, the great Philidor. He was a big pioneer of chess back in the day. As you can see, he's from the ancient times by his portrait there. But he was a big thinker when it came to chess and shaped how the game is played, particularly gave people the respect for pawns and what they can accomplish in a game. So there you have it, pawn chains, how to read them and how to make the most of the strategic plans that they provide in each game. And again, this applies to every single game. Look at where your pawns are pointing and apply this principle in your games, and you'll increase your win rate. So there you go. I'll catch you in the next lesson. See you later.